You aren't waving back. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the Friday Transportation Seminar at PSU. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member in Urban Studies and Planning and director of OTREC, and we help sponsor this seminar. I'm very happy to have all of you here. Before I introduce our speaker, I will remind folks who either have been here before or maybe you don't know, and this is new. We do webcast all of our seminars, and there are people who do watch on the web, either live right now or archived in the future. And so when we get to the, after Joe is finished speaking, and it's time to ask questions, please remember to use the microphones, and there should be one at about every desk. Hold the touch button, keep the red light lit while you're asking the question so that the people on the web can hear it. If for some reason there is not a working microphone near you, I will try to come by with this one that you can use. So that's our logistics. If you're a student enrolled in the class and I didn't mark you in, check with me afterwards to confirm your attendance. And without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Joe Cortright. Joe is an economist with Impresa Consulting here in Portland. He's been doing a lot of work lately with CEOs for cities, and which is what he's going to talk with us today about. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be back at Portland State. I've done a lot of work over the years working with folks, particularly in the Urban Studies program. My firm, Impresa, is a small economic consulting firm, as Jennifer mentioned. Our focus is on metropolitan regions, metropolitan economies, what makes them tick, why some metropolitan areas perform differently than others. And we've been doing a lot of work in the last couple of years looking at the way that urban form and transportation systems influence the economies and economic performance of metropolitan areas. And this is really the third in a series of reports that I've done working with the national organization CEOs for Cities. And CEOs for Cities is a national organization of urban leaders. It represents about 24 of the larger metropolitan areas in the country. And if you were to describe what CEO's mission statement was, it's really about changing the discussion about cities from describing cities as collections of pathologies, which has been the tendency in a lot of policy debate, to talking about cities as collections of assets and viewing that asset-based view as the place and the reason for developing strategies and policies that influence cities. The trilogy of reports that we've done that deal with transportation, land use, urban form, and metropolitan development began a couple of years ago with a report called The Green Dividend that looked at Portland and measured the way in which our transportation system, which enables people here to travel about 1/6 less than the average citizen of a large metropolitan area in the United States, produces additional economic activity, something on the order of $1 billion a year in additional spending that occurs locally because we don't have to spend as much on transportation, which is expenditures that leave the region. A year ago, we did a report that looked at the connection between rising gas prices and falling home values and found that the biggest declines in home values across the country were in the outlying areas of metropolitan areas, and that home values actually held up relatively well in the urban core. Our third report that I'll be talking about today, called Walking the Walk, looks at the connection between walkability and home values in large metropolitan areas around the United States. And so with that as an introduction, let me just do one other thing. I need to mention that this was really a collaborative research project. It was sponsored by CEOs for Cities, this national organization. But we had terrific support from a couple of organizations that you'll learn more about in a minute. One is a company up in Seattle called Front Seat, which invented an algorithm for measuring walkability called Walkscore. Anybody heard of Walkscore before? Okay, great. About a little more than half. That's great. And we also collaborated with a realty firm called Zip Realty that does essentially online real estate information. And between the databases that were compiled by Front Seat and Zip Realty, we got a very detailed and rich picture of the real estate markets in the United States that provided the basis for this study. So with that as a quick introduction, and I think I can click this button, I'll give you a roadmap to the presentation here. The other thing I should mention, and that Jennifer maybe mercifully left out of my introduction, is that I spent about a dozen years working for the state legislature down in Salem. And there was no way that I could have ever spoken to a group of legislators for as long as I've already spoken to you without being interrupted for questions. So I'm very well trained to take questions in the course of the presentation. And if it's okay with Jennifer, if you have a question, just raise your hand, tap the button, and I'll answer it. That way, hopefully, it'll be a little bit more interactive than it would otherwise be. But the 5 points that I really want to cover in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about this concept of walkability and how we measure it, and distinguish really between sort of physical measures of walkability and accessibility measures, and I'll draw that distinction for you in a moment. Then second, I'll talk about the Walkscore algorithm, how we actually computed walkability and how that measure works. Then I'll touch briefly on the core tool that we used in the study, which is something called hedonic price analysis. And it's basically a way of decomposing the contribution of different attributes of complex products in a way that you can establish the separate value of each of the components of a complex product. And that's what we're doing here. We're essentially looking at homes. We know that homes are complex bundles of products. They have various attributes. Each of those attributes has value. And what we're trying to figure out is, net of all the other characteristics of housing, how does walkability influence the value of homes? Then I'll give you the results of our model, show you how it plays out in a couple of metropolitan areas, and then talk about what we think some of the policy implications of that work are. So, to begin, walkability. If you think about cities and why cities exist from an economic perspective, I think Harvard's Ed Glazer put it best. Cities are the absence of space between people. They facilitate interactions of all kinds, social, economic, political, cultural, because there's less distance between people in cities. And that less distance is important not because we're all huddled together, but because there are more opportunities for interaction. It's more convenient, it's less costly, there's more variety of interaction in cities. So if you think about cities and define cities, one of the ways to think about it is in terms of accessibility. And walkability is one of the key characteristics of accessibility. It is still a primary means by which people get around, particularly in the cores of urban areas and in the most urban types of activity. And so if you believe that argument about cities and the economic importance of accessibility, then walkability ought to have some value. Nobel laureate Robert Lucas put it this way: why do people pay higher rents for being in cities when it would always be cheaper to be in a more rural location? And his argument was, his answer to that question was, people are paying for access to other people. That's the core reason. So if they're paying for access, walkability, which is a key form of access, ought to have some value. So that's the underlying argument for our point. And those of you who have studied urban and economics and regional studies know, Jane Jacobs has done an absolutely masterful and poetic job of really describing the way walkability enhances the function of cities. And we know that there are a lot of physical characteristics of cities and particular places within cities that enhance walkability. Short blocks, connected streets, the role of the sidewalk, mixes of different housing types and different commercial and public uses. But what I want to suggest to you is we'll be talking about measuring walkability in a very particular way that will not be a physical or an engineering description of walkability, but what would be more of an accessibility measure. So if you look at this, which is probably a marvelous surface on which to walk, the question then is there any place to walk to? And that's really what the Walkscore and our study focuses on, is on destinations rather than on facilities. And that may be one of the limitations, but we can come back to that as we discuss. Are there places that people can actually walk to as opposed to simply having physical facilities on which one can walk? Now this is a snapshot of the Walkscore.com website, and I know many of you have looked at it. This is essentially Irvington in Northeast Portland. And you can basically see what Walkscore does is take Google Maps, which has a directory of businesses, of schools, of public places, and it extracts from Google Maps information about the distance to the nearest of a series of locations. And you can see some of them listed on the left-hand side of the screen there: grocery stores, restaurants, coffee shops, bars, schools, parks, libraries, and so on. And so what it does is look up the distance to the nearest activity in each of several categories, and then computes a score, which it normalizes to a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being the most walkable, 0 being the least walkable. So you can look up, using this tool, the walkability or Walkscore for any address in the United States. And the great thing about Walkscore is that it is ubiquitous. It covers the entire United States. It is free. Anybody can use it. And it is transparent. You can see how the score is calculated, what destinations they relied on to compute the score. So the nice thing about this tool, and frankly the business plan of the folks at Front Seat, is to augment the set of information that's available to consumers about the walkability of different residential choices. If you dig down a little bit deeper, here are the categories. I think there are 13 or 14 of them that they use in their algorithm. I'd like to say that they went through a very detailed scientific process to select these categories, but they didn't. I think they just did it by guess and by gosh. They're actually in the process, though, of doing a reevaluation of Walkscore to essentially see what are the destinations that make the biggest difference. So that list could change. But if you think about it, it's kind of a common sense list of daily destinations that people would be likely to go to, and would be, if it was within walking distance, they might be the sort of things that they would walk to. Yeah, question?
This is Levi Roberts. I was just wondering if the different destinations are weighed differently in the algorithm.
Great.
The grocery store is higher than...
Great question. No, the question is, and I'll just repeat it quickly, are any of the destinations weighted differently? And the short answer is no, they are not weighted differently. But as you'll see in a minute, there's essentially a good correspondence or a good correlation between the absolute density of those destinations. Where you find more of those destinations close at hand, they tend to be more walkable. And the folks at the Bureau of Planning have been working on, here in Portland, have been working on 20-minute neighborhoods for some time. They use a different algorithm, one that weights grocery stores more heavily, that includes some measures of elevation, looking at barriers, and so on. They come up with, when you look at the pattern across the city of Portland, a very similar pattern of walkability. So it may not be that the weighting factors have a huge impact on walkability. Although if you were to do some sort of component analysis, my guess is that some of these would pop out as more influential than others in shaping Walkscore. So how it's computed, it's a very simple algorithm in a way. It looks at the straight line distance to each of those 13 categories. It relies on the Google Maps database, which is for listings of businesses and other destinations. It's not perfect. We think it's pretty comprehensive, but again, it's accurate enough to give us a good relative estimation of a walkability of different locations. It does, however, have some limitations. It doesn't address issues of topography and physical barriers. So if there is a freeway or a hill or a river between you and that straight line distance, it's not picked up by this. It doesn't address the quality of the physical infrastructure that you might use, whether in fact there are sidewalks. It doesn't look at issues of street connectivity, so things like small blocks and other things that we know tend to influence the walkability of physical locations aren't addressed. And those are all issues that actually in the next revision of Walkscore they're looking at adding in some method of dealing with those. So the Walkscore ranges. The most walkable destinations tend to have scores of 70 or higher. The most car-dependent destinations have very low scores, 50 or less, typically. Yes, a question. And can you push your button there, and that's what we should do. Yep.
Okay. So if you're not using street connectivity and quality sidewalks as one of your measurements, then let's say you're measuring a route in Southwest, how would that should be a very bad route. How would you determine that if you're not using those measures?
Well, again, we're just measuring the straight line distance between points. So it could be that, for example, somebody who is sort of on top of the West Hills here, directly above us, would be shown as having a relatively high Walkscore, even though it was a vertical distance of several hundred feet. And so that's one of the inaccuracies or limitations of the Walkscore algorithm. It just doesn't simply doesn't factor that into consideration. But as you'll see, even with those limitations, and we can go through some specific examples, it still does discriminate relatively well between places that are highly walkable and ones that aren't, because there are relatively few exceptions to that general rule that places that have lots of destinations close at hand tend to be very walkable. And the other things I'd invite you to do is just the great thing about Walkscore is you could get online, you could look at any set of addresses you want and see for particular addresses and test for yourself how accurate you think, based on your own personal observation, its measurements are. They also, if you have an iPhone, they have an iPhone app for Walkscore now as well. And if you look across metropolitan areas, and they have constructed these heat maps for different metropolitan areas, it corresponds to your sort of intuitive perception of where relatively walkable areas are. This is the map for Seattle. Downtown Seattle is pretty much dead center there. You can see the dark green, which corresponds to the highest level of walkability, is quite common in the center of Seattle, and then it tends to fade out as you move away from the center. And then there's some peripheral areas adjacent to the Sound and Lake Washington, where there are relatively few walkable destinations nearby, and walkability scores tend to be lower. So that gives you a good idea of sort of the geographic pattern within a particular metropolitan area. You can look at that same kind of map for basically any of the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. So that's the Walkscore tool, and what we did was to take that and plug that into our analysis of housing values. And what we used to analyze or decompose the value of housing is this technique that economists call hedonic modeling. And hedonic modeling is based on the notion that there are complex goods that have a variety of characteristics, and that in establishing the price for them, the market price for them, consumers place different values on those different characteristics. And if you think about housing, the characteristics that influence the value of housing are a set of things having to deal with the structure itself. How big is it? How old is it? What kind of amenities does it have? How many bedrooms, square feet, bathrooms, how nice the kitchen is, and the like. Then there are also characteristics of the neighborhood in which the house is located. Is it a nice neighborhood? Is it a bad neighborhood? Does it have lots of physical attributes like tree cover, parks, and so on, views, and the like? Is it a high-income or low-income neighborhood? How good are the schools, and so on? And those things show up in the market price of a good or service. And what the hedonic price analysis does is essentially let us break out or attribute the separate value of each of those characteristics. Hedonic models have been used for about the past 35 or 40 years. They're used, for example, in the computation of the Consumer Price Index. They've been used in real estate since about the 1970s, and pretty well-established methodology, particularly for housing markets, because housing is one of those particularly complex goods. I mean, if you're talking about breakfast cereal, not so much variation. If you're talking about houses, very great deal of variety between one house and the next house. They've been used particularly in environmental studies to break out the contribution of environmental quality to property value. We've attributed value to parks, to views, to tree cover, to watershed proximity. Noel Nedesel at Reed College, who actually helped provide some review of the study, has done a lot of really good work here in Portland to apply the hedonic modeling to both parks and transit. It's also been used to look at clean air, crime, and other factors. So the data that we used for this study, as I said, the firm Zip Realty, which has a national database of housing sales, shared with us records of 94,000 home sales around the country in 15 different markets for roughly the period 2006-2007. And in each of these markets, we had at least 5,000 home sale observations. So the nice thing about this data is it gives us a large enough sample size that we can get relatively reliable estimates of the values that we're looking at. Interestingly, when you go through the hedonic literature, most of the hedonic literature is sort of a one market at a time set of studies. So we were very fortunate in this case to get data, comparable data, across a bunch of different markets, and that helped us with the analysis, as you'll see. Now, the different variables that we looked at, we really had two sets of variables here. We had a set of variables that dealt with the characteristics of each individual house, the structure. We knew how big it was, how many bedrooms and bathrooms it had, when it was constructed, and whether it was a single-family dwelling or a condominium. And then we constructed a series of neighborhood variables. We had the address of each of these houses, so we knew how close the neighborhood in which it was located was to the center of the region. Economists for a long time have observed a rent gradient, that people pay a higher premium to be close to the center for accessibility, so we controlled for that. We also looked at job access, how many jobs there were in the vicinity of the neighborhood using a 3-mile radius. We also looked at the income level of the neighborhood as a way of controlling for the effects of crime, poverty, and school quality. And then we also threw in Walkscore, and the folks at Front Seat calculated for us for each of those 95,000 or so houses, its Walkscore, so we knew that. So those are the variables that we looked at, and here are the results. We found that after you controlled for all of those observable characteristics that explain variation in housing prices, how big the house was, bedrooms, bathrooms, age, neighborhood characteristics like income, centrality, and the like, that walkability had a positive and statistically significant impact on home values in 13 of the 15 metropolitan areas that we looked at. In 2 metropolitan areas, there was not a positive relationship. In one of them, Las Vegas, the relationship was negative. More walkable properties in Las Vegas actually had a lower price after you controlled for all the other characteristics, and we're not sure why. And in one metropolitan area, there was no statistically significant relationship between walkability and home prices. That is, after you controlled for all those other characteristics, walkability just didn't simply seem to affect value one way or the other. We were fortunate in one market, Austin, to have access to a similar hedonic price analysis that was done using most of the same variables that we used. So we were able to compare our estimates for the values of certain key coefficients and the fit of our model with this model that was constructed from different data for the same market using, again, a slightly different specification. And we found out that our common variables fit just about the same way. That is, our estimate of a value of an additional square foot was the same as the other model that had done for Austin. So we're reasonably confident that our modeling and our modeling approach fits with the literature that's been done elsewhere. And the overall, when you look at the explanatory variables, they are very consistent with the published literature here. So what we found is, to boil it down to a single number, each additional 1-point improvement in Walkscore was associated with a gain of about $700 to $3,000 in home price across all of these metropolitan areas. Now, as you'll see in a minute, there is some variation from metropolitan area to metropolitan area. But we view this as a fairly significant contribution of walkability. Now, you need to put that in context because it's difficult to move a house from being a 0 Walkscore to a 100 Walkscore. So in theory, if you looked at that bottom number, that would add, like $70,000 to the price of a house. So what we did was to look at what's the range of variation that you actually observe in different metropolitan areas in terms of walkability. So when you go from a house with just the typical level of walkability to an above average level of walkability, not 100, if you go from 50 to 70, which is the range that you find in most metropolitan areas, how much does that add to the value? So we did that and looked in detail. I'll give you we did this for each of our metropolitan areas. I'll do Charlotte. Because it's sort of in the middle of our range of estimates. It's a relatively typical instance for a metropolitan area. It's in the middle by size and in terms of our results. In Charlotte, each 1-point increase in Walkscore was associated with, roughly speaking, about a $2,000 increase in home value. Again, controlling for all those other observable characteristics of housing. So I'll give you the Walkscore information for a couple of different neighborhoods. This first neighborhood is Ashley Park. And Ashley Park, I don't even see it really well, is right here. The center of Charlotte is basically here. So it's a relatively close-in neighborhood, but it's not sort of in the urban core. And it has a Walkscore for the whole neighborhood that averages about 54, which turns out is the median for the entire metropolitan area in Charlotte, North Carolina. And you can see a list of neighborhoods here along the left-hand side. This is from the Front Seat website. Yes?
So you said earlier that a score of 70 or higher was considered pretty walkable. What color is 70?
Oh, this is a heat map. The green colors, the darker green colors are higher walk scores. The red colors are the lowest walk scores. Does that answer your question? The green color in the...
Green is 70 above.
Yeah, well, you know, yeah, right here you can see that it...
I can't see.
Oh, I'm sorry. The dark green is 90. The light green is 70 to 90. The yellowish is 50 to 70. The red is under 50. Okay? Sorry, it's easier to see from up here than back there. So in this neighborhood, which you can see is sort of in the yellowish, pale red, so it's again, right about 54 is the average for that whole neighborhood. So that's the typical neighborhood in Charlotte. Now, if you compare it with another neighborhood that is otherwise very similar in all characteristics, it's the Wilmore neighborhood. And you'll recall the first neighborhood was here. Ashley Park was here. Wilmore is here. So very close by, same side of town, similar demographics. The difference is the walk score in the Wilmore neighborhood is 71 on average, which basically places it at the 75th percentile. It is above average. It's not 100, it's not 90, which is the top one here, 91, the Cherry neighborhood, but it's sort of above average. So the question that we posed, hypothetically, is if you had two identical houses, you know, same square feet, bedrooms, bathrooms, age, and so on, and one was in Ashley Park and one was in Wilmore, where the only difference was the walkability of the two houses, what would be the difference in price? So our equations suggest that it would be about a 12% difference in housing price between the average level of walkability and that above average level of walkability. You'd go from about a $280,000 house in Ashley Park to about a $314,000 house in Wilmore. Now, I should hasten to add that these are 2006, 2007 numbers, and housing prices in Charlotte, as they have everywhere else, have come down since then by, I think they're in the about 20% range. So I wouldn't put a lot of, if you're buying real estate in Charlotte tomorrow, don't rely on those numbers. But the 12 percentage point difference, we think, is really the thing to pay attention to. So that's a very significant difference in house prices. And we did that same computation essentially for each of the cities that are in our sample. You can see Charlotte here, it's in the 30,000 range. And this is the difference between moving from the average level of walkability for our sample to moving to that 75th percentile. And typically, in most metropolitan areas, it produces a gain of between $10,000 and $30,000 in home price. You can see Bakersfield, no statistical relationship. In Las Vegas, again, improving walkability actually lowered the value of the house. Yes, there in the back.
Just curious, is that Bakersfield, California?
Yes, Bakersfield, California.
Do you have any ideas about why they're so close?
You know, we haven't looked closely enough at the individual markets to know what goes on. I've had some people offer some hypotheses that in Las Vegas we're picking up gated community effects, that Las Vegas may have a sort of a different pattern of development. But I honestly don't know. The thing that we're struck by here is 13 of the 15 metropolitan areas we get the result, and in 2 we don't. The other thing I'd say is a much larger fraction of the housing stock in both Las Vegas and Bakersfield is new. It's a much more recent vintage. You think about the level of growth that you've seen in both of those places in the last 15 or 20 years. It's much higher on average than these other cities that we looked at in our sample. But exactly what's driving that, I couldn't say. The other thing that's interesting here is one of the hypotheses that people have is that somehow walkability commands a premium because it is relatively rare. That is, walkability is worth more in some places because there are so few walkable places. But our results suggest, and I won't say we've conclusively decided this question, but that there are actually increasing returns to walkability. That is, a walkable house in a city that has more walkable neighborhoods or a higher walk score seems to have an even higher premium associated with it. So if you look at, for example, Chicago and San Francisco, which are among the highest here, they're places that have very high levels of walkability across the board. Their walk score is higher for the metropolitan area. And yet the most walkable places there are places that are above average in walkability still command a very large premium over places that are average in walkability. So in each case, we've normed this to what the value is in that metropolitan area. And again, it's the case that places with transit systems, Arlington is a suburb of Washington, D.C., Charlotte, Chicago, Sacramento, and San Francisco are all cities with rail transit systems. And that may be a complementary factor here when we're talking about the impact of walkability. Was there a question there? No. Okay. But again, you see the positive gain to walkability in large cities, Chicago, San Francisco, and then in smaller ones, Stockton, Tucson, even Fresno, you see a positive effect of walkability here. So that's really the core finding of our work. So, yes?
Were those added values then normed to the median price? In other words, a $40,000 difference in San Francisco is not nearly as big as
right.
a $40,000 difference in Dallas.
We haven't done that on this chart, but in the report, and I should hasten to add, the report is available free online at the CEOs for Cities website, but we show you the percentage gain for each metropolitan area. But you're absolutely right. The percentage gain in a place like San Francisco is smaller than it is in, obviously, in a less expensive housing market like, say, Stockton. Absolutely. And when I say San Francisco, that's San Francisco Bay Area, not just city of San Francisco. These are all metro area designations, essentially. So what do we think the implications are of this bit of work? First of all, whoops, I went too far, I think. Okay. We think that walkability has the effect, is an amenity that consumers place value on, and is clearly associated with higher housing values. And that, in turn, I think has a couple of implications. One is, and again, the way we measured walkability here is in terms of accessibility. And accessibility isn't just a product of the built environment in the sense of the physical environment that's out there, the housing units, the roads and sidewalks, and the commercial buildings. It's a function of the activities or the development that occurs in those places as well. So it's the presence of those activities, like the coffee shop, the restaurant, the grocery store, rather than the physical building in which it is located, that seems to be the driver of value here. Now, we'd like to do more work with this question of physical facilities and see, does improving the physical facilities on top of the accessibility add value, but we haven't done that yet. The other thing that seems clear from our work, when you really think about it, what is Walkscore measuring? If you go back to that list of 13 different uses, places that have high scores are almost by definition what you would call mixed-use development, whether they're officially designated that or not. They are functionally places where there are a lot of different uses. And the places across metropolitan areas that have the lowest scores on walkability consistently are the places that are essentially these large, homogeneously zoned residential areas. If you are in a residential area, an area that's zoned only for single-family residential, it's unlikely that you'll have a very high walk score because most commercial uses are prohibited and things like schools, libraries, and so on may be pushed to the edge or less common in those single-family residential areas. So part of what we're measuring here in terms of walkability is really the value that people place on being in a mixed-use area. And then finally, the other thing that we think is clear is that some of what we're picking up is transit accessibility. And this is similar to the issue with mixed use, that when you look at places that have high walk scores, they tend to be places where there are a lot of stores, restaurants, and other commercial activity. It tends to be like arterial streets in cities. And those arterial streets also happen to be the routes that are most commonly covered by transit systems and higher frequency transit systems. So some of what we think we've picked out here is the contribution of transit. And actually transit and walkability go hand in hand. It may be really difficult to separate out the differential contributions of those two things. But while we've labeled it walking the walk, and we think it really does measure things that are walkable in terms of distance, we know that there are other related characteristics that we're picking up, particularly mixed use and transit.
Bill?
Yeah.
In terms of this study and other Obama administration, so public policy could be developed out of these findings?
Yeah, that's a great question, Randy. We had CEOs for cities had one of its meetings in Washington about 3 weeks ago. We did a presentation on walking the walk. We had the Assistant Secretary for Policy from U.S. Department of Transportation in that meeting. So, yeah, we are getting this out, and we're also talking to various folks in the administration about this research and other items on our research agenda. So, thanks for that question. So I think got one final slide here. What are the takeaways here? It's really clear that there's a strong connection between walkability and residential property values. One of the interesting questions that we're looking at as a follow-up to this is to see whether these more walkable properties did a better job of hanging on to their value as the housing market declined in the United States over the last couple of years. That is, other things being equal, did houses that had higher walk scores retain more of their value? Because that would be a real important indicator to policy officials about the kind of housing that we ought to be encouraging, investing in, and the like. Also an indicator to financial institutions about the sort of thing that they ought to be lending on. But overwhelmingly, I think what we're seeing here is that there's very strong evidence of a market demand, consumer value, that's tied to walkable mixed-use development and then also is transit served, which I think is an important message as we think about both the economic situation we're in, but then as we move forward and thinking about how we deal with climate change and how we build more vibrant urban economic environments. So with that, Jennifer, I don't know how we're doing on time. We have time for more questions.
We do have time for questions, and we'll
Great.
open it up. And I'm going to remind everyone to try to remember to use the microphone on your table because we are webcasting. So people on the web, if there is no microphone, I'll come bring this one to you. And just in case anyone was wondering, I checked, and the walk score for this location is 98. So I don't know how we score 100. I'm guessing hardware store is missing nearby.
Yeah, probably.
That's mine. Okay, so go ahead, raise hands, and you can call.
Yeah, they're in the back.
I think walkability is highly related to crime rate. So how do you think about that?
What, you think walkability is highly related to crime rates?
Yes.
We didn't look at that issue in particular. We didn't integrate. The two things we would have liked to add to the model would be crime rates and school performance. But based on our review of the literature, we know that there's a very strong correlation between neighborhood income levels and crime rates. So we tried to proxy that through that measure. But I think it's still an open question as to whether you were to throw actual crime rates for different areas into the mix. And I should mention that my colleagues at Reed College, Noel Nedesel and Nico Drake McLaughlin, are working on an application of hedonic modeling specific to the Portland metropolitan area that includes a much longer list of explanatory variables, particularly the environmental ones, so that they can see whether that influences it. But my priors would be on this issue of crime, that if crime was associated with walkability, that would actually tend to reverse the sign of the relationship that we found. We found a positive relationship between walkability and home values, so that if crime were strongly correlated with walkability, we would expect it to actually reduce values instead of raise them. But maybe if we take crime out, we'll get an even higher value for walkability than we did. Yeah, they're in the back.
Kind of just as an add-on to that, you think that's the problem with the Las Vegas? The walkability and the crime?
That's a reasonable suggestion, but again, I hesitate to speculate not having looked at the data. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, do we think the crime rates might be part of the explanation for Las Vegas and Bakersfield? Yeah, well, it could be. It could be an important omitted variable in some places, and that may be what's going on there. But I wouldn't speculate. Yes.
Do you guys have any plans to conduct any research that would maybe differentiate between how transit influences home prices and how try and separate that more from just walkability?
I think that's a question that, again, my colleagues at Reed may be addressing, because I know they have access to some transit information. But my suspicion is that it may be difficult because there's so much collinearity. There's going to be a lot of collinearity between the transit variable and the walkability variable. But it's certainly going to be interesting to take a closer look at that.
Any additional?
Is there any consideration to going out to a random sample of neighborhoods ranging from 0 to 100 and actually doing pedestrian counts to make sure that there actually is a correlation?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do people walk more in more walkable neighborhoods? Yeah, I have not seen research yet that ties that to the Walkscore algorithm. I have seen research that's published, and I think we included some references to this in the Walking the Walk report, that people using other measures like density, for example, did in fact find that people walk more in denser areas or places where there were, and I think they've used things like grocery stores or other commercial destinations. But that's the one thing we don't have at this point, is something that definitively ties Walkscore to actual walking. And one of the things that I would add here is, if you think about it, part of the benefit that people are getting is not simply the ability to walk to destinations, but destinations that are walkable are also drivable in a shorter period of time. So it means they're more convenient by whatever mode you might choose to use. So this is really a measure of accessibility. And it is probably the opportunity to walk, whether in fact you actually walk to those destinations or not. Yeah?
Many of the metro areas that you had up there, the cities were founded on the walking city principle. And I was curious, for like the newer metro areas, like Phoenix, was the walkability a larger impact on the price differential?
You know, again, I think we have a pretty good mix here. You know, I wish we had more. You know, we have a lot of sort of Sunbelt cities. Florida, Texas, California figure prominently in this list, and arguably Chicago is the only big cold weather northeastern Midwestern city that we have. And in order to answer that question, I think we need to have a little bit more diverse a sample of metropolitan areas. We have recently gotten the data for Boston, but have not done the analysis on it. But we'd like to do a little bit more work to sort of test this in some other metropolitan areas. Yeah.
Would there in the future be any consideration for looking at the types of businesses or those destinations that are within that proximity of those houses? Say, for instance, if you have 10 bars, that might have a negative impact.
Mm-hmm.
How would you look at that?
Yeah, right now it's a very simple-minded measure that does two things. First, it only registers the first instance of any particular kind of business. So you count to the nearest grocery store, to the nearest bar, and so on. And that doesn't pick up either the costs or the benefits of having lots of choices nearby. It may be good to be near one bar but not near 10. It may be better to be near 10 restaurants and not near only one. And we haven't made any real qualitative distinctions here either. There may be a difference between, a Subway sandwich shop and a very nice local organic food restaurant in terms of its value on walkability. But this is a pretty simple-minded measure. But again, the folks at Walkscore are working on sort of the next iteration of this. And one of the great things I'll say about this is it's very much an open source philosophy that guides them. They're in the process of publishing the algorithm that they use. They're inviting a lot of comment. They're undertaking research to test new versions of it. So I think it's the sort of thing where there will be a lot of opportunity for public discussion, dialogue, and contribution that improves the utility of this as a way of gauging walkability. But the thing I would stress here is that, particularly when you look at some of those heat maps, I think what we're getting is something that's probably about 85% of the way there. That this very simple measure distinguishes between places that are walkable and aren't walkable on a very accurate basis in at least 85% of the cases. And so what we're doing with these additional refinements are sort of making it a little bit better, but I don't expect a huge quantum change in measures of walkability with any of the refinements that people have talked about. We'll just take out a few of those outliers that are special cases. Yes, there in the way back.
I was just thinking, do you think there might be a risk that low-income neighborhoods will fear walkability improvements, thinking that it might raise the home values so that they won't be able to afford properties in that area anymore?
I think that's a really interesting question. It's essentially what we're doing is saying walkability, like good schools, like the presence of parks and public amenities, or a low crime rate, creates additional value. And whether that benefits or penalizes low-income communities depends on a whole bunch of factors. One is, do you own the property? If you're a low-income person and you own a piece of property and its walkability improves, your home equity has improved. Or to put it in more contemporary terms, our suspicion is that we're going to look at is those places that had higher walk scores may have hung on to their values more, so that people have lost less equity. Now, the case that I think is really the important one is renters. If you're a renter, and walkability improves and the quality of your neighborhood improves, maybe your rent goes up. The important thing I think to think about there is, and this is true for everybody as well, is walkability implies that people don't have to spend as much money on transportation. So those more walkable neighborhoods are ones where the cost of all forms of transportation, number of miles driven, bus, and so on, is lower. And so some of the benefits of walkability show up in terms of savings in transportation costs. And there's a great body of work that's been done by the folks at the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago that show more dense neighborhoods, ones with good transit access, enable people to spend less money on transportation. So to some extent, the additional cost is offset by lower transportation costs. Jennifer.
I'm going to throw out one of the questions from one of our web viewers. Is there a strong correlation between neighborhood age and walkability?
Is there a strong correlation between neighborhood age and walkability? We didn't look at that directly. We looked at house age, so you could have a new house in an old neighborhood. Now, there's a really good study that was done by Metro a year or 2 years ago that looked at the variation in house prices among neighborhoods in the Portland metropolitan area and found that the pre-war neighborhoods, the sort of traditional grid-type neighborhoods, had appreciated at a faster rate in the last, I think, decade or so than the post-war neighborhoods. So, and that's consistent with a story about walkability because you have better street connectivity, you generally tend to have more mixed uses and so on. And I mentioned that because I thought it was a really interesting study, but that's not something that we addressed directly in our study. Although we did throw in proximity to the urban core, which again is more or less, as cities progress or develop outward, the newer neighborhoods tend to be close in, although that's not universally the case. Yes, there.
I know around the Portland area, when you're looking at apartments or houses, they'll actually say the Walkscore in the
Great.
advertisement for a lot of them. And I was wondering if the real estate community or the building developing community, kind of what they've done with the Walkscore and how they're using it to make decisions.
The folks at Walkscore are the best way to describe them, if they're listening, I hope they won't be offended when I say this, they're software geeks who want to change the world. And they want to change it with information. And that's exactly their business model, is that they want to get Walkscore on websites. They want consumers asking about it. And they're sort of going to the next level now of putting a search tool on a website. So when you're searching for a house or an apartment, you can say, I want one with, I want one with 2 bedrooms, and I want it with a Walkscore of at least some number. So it will only show you those properties and so on. But I think that is explicitly the objective, is to put that additional piece of information out there to help consumers make better decisions. But what our results show is that at least in some intuitive way, people are already valuing that. And this just gives them better information. And the other thing that I mentioned is, you've all probably heard of LEED, the LEED standard. I think LEED is great for sort of pushing the state of the art, but it really only applies to a tiny fraction of the building stock that's out there. The great thing about Walkscore is it's ubiquitous. It applies to all of the 130 or 40 million housing units in the United States. It's free, and it gives people very clear, understandable information. Basically, LEED only influences a tiny fraction of the investment decisions that are made in this country. And Walkscore potentially could influence every single residential decision, which I think is very powerful leverage for driving markets going forward. Yes, there.
Yeah, I was curious to see if there's been any interest in using the street view of the Google Maps to maybe see if there was any relationship between certain urban design characteristics and value, whether it's, I guess, residential or maybe even commercial, would have a bigger impact?
Boy, that's a great question. I know that on a number of real estate sites, and I don't know if this is the case on the Walkscore site, you can sort of segue from the Google Maps view to a street view, but then how you would aggregate that for analytical purposes. I mean, you and I could individually look at a property and say, what does it look like? But the problem would be aggregating that in a systematic way to, say something's valid about all these sites. So I don't know how you do that.
I think we've come up with a couple dissertation topics.
Great.
This is sort of following off that last question, but is there a way to qualitatively measure these walkability places as in bike ped paths versus just plain old sidewalks? Or?
Again, I think that's the next thing that the folks at Walkscore are interested in doing, is looking more at physical characteristics and starting with the relatively simple things like street connectivity, then using something on the web to discern the existence of sidewalks, and I'm not sure technically how easy or difficult that's going to be, and then beyond that to get to questions of bike paths and so on. But that's the direction that they want to go in, and I think the question is, how far down that path can they get? Yes, they're in the way back.
Do you know if Walkscore is going to be doing any research, or if there's already research on there on walkability scores with respect to disabilities, specifically mobility and vision impairment disabilities?
I don't know the answer to that question, and that's it would be a great one to pose to the folks at Front Seat, and I could certainly put you in contact with them. Yes, over here.
Well, don't you think that most of these, though, questions, which are very intriguing and would definitely represent sort of next steps, are the difference between passive and active? In other words, you can passively collect data about housing values from existing databases relatively easily and calculate distances using Google. But all the other great ideas that we've heard require observations of each individual property or sidewalk or whatever it is.
Yeah, instinctively I agree with you, but the thing that I'm struck by is how much more and richer data that we have, and how clever people are at applying technology to discerning some of this. This may be, I haven't done the research, but this may be the largest sample in any hedonic price analysis of housing that's ever been done. And it exists as the byproduct, the incidental byproduct in a way, of stuff that was constructed for other purposes. So I share your skepticism. I mean, and it's very expensive and difficult to get that, particularly that qualitative information, which is often really important. But I don't think we've bumped up against the limits of sort of using technology and massive computer power in particular to sort of figure out some of this stuff. And it isn't that you'll get 100% of the way there, but like with Walkscore, I think you can get 80, 85, 90% of the way there and discern pretty clearly what's going on. Yes, here.
This is probably beyond the scope, but I'm still interested in a lot of the mixed-use development that's going on right now, especially in Portland, and with the city and DEC trying to have affordable housing put know that we're going on the wrong track by trying to get affordable housing in mixed use and thinking it's going to stay that way? Or do we need to rethink how we're going to make affordable housing work, or do we just need to have like hard and fast kind of requirements about it to make it happen?
Well, I think affordable housing is an access and opportunity issue and an equity issue. How do we help people who are don't have the economic resources to get access to housing, and that's not just with regard to walkable neighborhoods, but it's with regard to neighborhoods of all different kinds of characteristics. So, I view this as a way of building the economic case that there is a return at an economic level, at a metropolitan level, for the things that you do that make neighborhoods more walkable. And then on top of that, we have to think about what the equity implications are. But clearly, walkable neighborhoods are ones that are attractive, are desirable, and have value. Dylan.
Hey, Joe. I was curious how you developed the list of cities. In particular, Portland's not on the list, but Arlington is, but it's a subset of a larger metro area, of the D.C. area. And second, how would your results have been different if you had, say, 10 years of data instead of 2, or perhaps 1986 and 87 instead of 06 and 07?
Yeah. The cities were chosen for us. They were the ones that Zip Realty had data for that they could share with us. They gave us a little bit longer list of cities, but they didn't have the full set of variables for all of them. And then we excluded a couple because we had only a few hundred observations for a city. So basically it was dictated by the data. And we're working with them to get data on other cities. And then your second question about sort of doing a time series analysis on it, that's really our next step. We want to look to see whether the places that have higher walk scores fared better, particularly in what's happened in the last couple of years in terms of prices. The challenge going backwards is that data is less interesting to people who are selling it to they have it because they're tracking transactions now because they're selling real estate now or participating in listing real estate now. And so we don't have the historical data that's of the same quality. Although, that's the nice thing about drilling deep into one market like Portland, and the folks at Reed, I think, may have more capability to look into that time series question than we do. Yes?
If walkability incorporates accessibility and return livability within a community, I see on those heat grids that you had shown that it shows more of a central city component. Now in Portland, we've been very much pushing the idea of 20-minute neighborhoods, and do you see more neighborhood development or community development being incorporated into pockets or segments around the city rather than a centralized city component?
That's a great question. And one of the things I note, and I could probably just click back here very quickly, see we're almost to the end of the time, but if you look at this list of variables that we used, we had a separate variable to deal with the issue of centrality. So we found a value for Walkscore independent of or after controlling for how central something was. The other thing I'd kind of hasten to add here is what we're measuring is the walkability of individual houses and not the walkability of whole neighborhoods. So this basically is telling you that a house, and there can be considerable variation within a neighborhood, depending on whether you're close to that commercial part of your neighborhood or far away from it, your walk score will go up and down. And the next thing we like to do is develop some sort of aggregated measures, and that's another thing we're working with the folks at Walkscore on, is can we characterize the walkability of a whole neighborhood, and do more walkable houses in more walkable neighborhoods have higher values than, say, and so on. But that's really the next step in that bit of research. Thanks for your question.
So before we thank our speaker, I need to let people know who will be coming next week. We have Professor David Strayer from University of Utah, who's going to be talking about research on distracted drivers, a very important topic of late. And so I hope to see many of you here next week as well. Thank you very much, Joe, for coming.
Thank you. My pleasure.